Let me read to you a passage from the 5th chapter of St. Mark's Gospel, verses 1 to 20. It's the Gospel for Monday of the 4th week in Ordinary Time. St. Mark writes, Jesus and his disciples came to the other side of the sea, to the territory of the Gerasenes. When he got out of the boat, at once a man from the tombs who had an unclean spirit met him. The man had been dwelling among the tombs, and no one could restrain him any longer, even with a chain. In fact, he had frequently been bound with shackles and chains, but the chains had been pulled apart by him, and the shackles smashed, and no one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the hillsides, he was always crying out and bruising himself with stones. Catching sight of Jesus from a distance, he ran up and prostrated himself before him, crying out in a loud voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." He had been saying to him, "Unclean spirit, come out of the man." He asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "Legion is my name. There are many of us." And he pleaded earnestly with him not to drive them away from that territory. Now a large herd of swine was feeding there on the hillside, and they pleaded with him, "Send us into the swine, let us enter them." And he let them, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine. The herd of about 2,000 rushed down a steep bank into the sea, where they were drowned. The swineherds ran away and reported the incident in the town and throughout the countryside. And people came out to see what had happened. As they approached Jesus, they caught sight of the man who had been possessed by Legion, sitting there clothed and in his right mind. And they were seized with fear. Those who witnessed the incident explained to them what had happened to the possessed man and to the swine. Then they began to beg him to leave their district. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed pleaded to remain with him. But Jesus would not permit him, but told him instead, "Go home to your family and announce to them all that the Lord in his pity has done for you." Then the man went off and began to proclaim in the Decapolis what Jesus had done for him, and all were amazed. That's from Mark chapter 5, verse 1 to 20. We are led to think of Christ and Satan. There have been various movies during the last few decades on devil possession. It is very interesting to notice that in almost all such movies, it is the Catholic priest who features as the one who drives out the demon, or who attempts to do so. Despite all its exaggerations, one of the best that I have seen is the movie The Exorcism of Emily Rose, a movie based remotely on a factual case of many years ago in Bavaria. In this movie, there were several demons possessing Emily, who was a good girl, and whose possession was portrayed as permitted by God in order to serve his wider redemptive plan. Now, in movies of this kind, the devil is characterized as a tremendous power, most difficult to dislodge, which to some extent is in fact correct. Let us then turn to the Gospel accounts, such as the one given to us in the Gospel I read. Christ and his disciples come to the pagan territory of the Gerasenes, and he is confronted immediately by, we read, a man from the tombs who had an unclean spirit. This unclean spirit may have been the principal demon possessing him, for when that devil was asked by our Lord for his name, he answered, "Legion is my name, there are many of us." The evil and havoc caused by the devils is evident in the description of the history of this hapless individual. We read, "The man had been dwelling among the tombs, and no one could restrain him any longer, even with a chain. In fact, he had frequently been bound with shackles and chains, but the chains had been pulled apart by him and the shackles smashed, and no one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the hillsides, he was always crying out and bruising himself with stones. But in the presence of Christ, all was different. The demons knew they were in the presence of one who effortlessly dominated them. We must have a healthy respect for the very reality of Satan and the demonic world, but at the same time realize that the underworld is not the slightest match for Christ. So amid all the threats that confront us in this world, threats coming from Satan, sin, and the effects of sin, Christ stands unseen in our midst as a source of unending strength. He is the stronger one in the face of sickness, the unruly natural elements, sin, and the underworld. The demons in our scene today come up to him and prostrate before him, beseeching that he not torment them. They plead with him that he not expel them from what had become their territory. They had struck roots there. The thought of trying to find a new nest elsewhere horrified them, suggesting that it was not easy for the demons to find a new abode outside hell itself. The implication might also be that once expelled by our Lord, they would not be permitted to inhabit a person again. So they pleaded with our Lord to let them at least go into the pigs. Notice the detail that Christ, while firm and commanding, is nevertheless somewhat kind even to the anguished demons. He gave them leave. The result of this was that the herd of pigs perished, showing again the destructive character of the demonic world, and Christ was asked by the superstitious inhabitants to leave the neighborhood. This he did. So Christ is holy, all-powerful, and kind. In his famous spiritual exercises, which St. Ignatius Loyola wrote to assist people to order their whole lives to the love and service of Christ, there is a particularly important meditation. It is called the meditation on the two standards. The one is the standard of Christ, the other the standard of Satan. The person doing the exercises is invited to place himself in the presence of these two standards and to make a choice between Christ and Satan. Well, let us do that as we place ourselves in our gospel scene, thinking of Christ on the one hand and the demons on the other. Our choice for Christ must be from the heart, repeated over and over, and lived out in the details of our everyday life. Christ would not let the newly released man follow him physically. That was not his calling. But he was given a mission by our Lord, and this he proceeded to do. Often in the Gospels, people who had benefited by our Lord's healing were told by him not to tell others about it. All too often they proceeded to disobey this request. In the case of our newly liberated man from the country of the Gerasenes, he did do what our Lord asked, which was to go home to your family and announce to them all that the Lord in his pity has done for you. Then the man went off and began to proclaim in the Decapolis what Jesus had done for him, and they were amazed. Let us resolve to follow Christ by doing God's will in our everyday life, whatever that might be.